And tonight we're going to do Elephantine Island, or also known as Aswan Island, in Upper Egypt, that is South Egypt, what was a border town in Egypt for many, many centuries, southernmost location. I want to start out with Google Earth. So I will fix my screen and share. Aha, I just love to see this honing in. Here we go. Fasten your seatbelt. Isn't that cool? So I'm waiting for the navigation thing to come up, and I don't see it at all. You can see, though, this is the Nile, of course. Here's the city of Aswan off to the east. Of course, this is modern. This is what it looks like right now, but there is a series of islands out here. And this tiny thing is Elephantine. It's very small. It's like 446 meters across and maybe a kilometer long. But it's also a most sacred place because it's full of temples. And even now they're digging things out of there. Where's my navigation bar here? That's weird. Huh. Yeah, there's always something. We're swarming in a little bit here. That shows Elephantine right in the middle of the river. Nothing much there. You can see ruins every place. Oh, isn't this great, though, to be able to hone in anywhere in the world and take a little trip? The satellite maps aren't complete here, obviously. And I have a little problem because I cannot find the navigation. I just don't know how to do this well enough to find it, but I have something else. Really, I just wanted to see it come in, the globe spin around. This is a good map that I found on the internet, and you can see where this border is now. Elephantine being up a little bit from the southern border. As I said, this was on the very southern border of Egypt for most of the time, but in the time of our studies, you remember when we talked about the war between Egypt and the Cushites. the ones from Sudan, right down here a little lower. And we were talking about Moses being the king of the Cushites for 30 years. Well, eventually, the Egyptians won out here and brought the boundary down to where it still is now. And you can see here the section of the Nile, it's dammed. I can remember, I guess I was in my childhood when Nasser dammed the Nile off down here. There was a lot of controversy about it, but he formed what we still call today the Aswan Dam. And that's in the same region. As you can see, the Nile here is split out a little bit on account of the dam to make a gigantic reservoir and a power plant down there. And also, because of the flooding of this land, there was here on the Egypt's southern border an ancient settlement called Alphi or Alphay. You've heard me talk about the Alphay priesthood in times past. My reading on that came before the Aswan Dam, and I'm thinking that was in 59 or the early 60s. I don't know how I retained some of this stuff, but I definitely remember that in the news, hearing about it on radio and so forth. I guess I was just that kind of kid, always looking into these current events, and I had people around me that said, Jackie, come look and see what happened here. The Russians sent a cosmonaut up. And oh, don't you want to hear the funeral for President Kennedy? Said, no, I want to go out and play. Oh, come here and watch the funeral on television. I had grandparents like that. But Alphay area was all flooded before they were able to do any excavations there. And that was one of the reasons there was an uproar about putting this dam in the Nile at this very place, because there were Jewish ruins, Hebrew ruins down there that had not been excavated, that are now completely underwater, including the little border town of Alphay. Gone, solid gone. Next, I have a short video that I thought was pretty good. And we have a narrator here who's evidently speaking on behalf of the Jews. And I've got to say that I have read controversial contradictions to what he has to say. So I'll just leave it at that and let you be the judge. This is, I think, 25 minutes long, but well worth the time. And I'm wondering if you can see this all right. Wonder if I could get a full screen here. That's about all I can get. I want to make sure that you can hear the narrative. This is real mystery. Nobody knows anything about this really. It's all speculation. But what we have are extensive texts in Aramaic and Demotic and even some in hieroglyphics that take us through antiquity in this area. And yes, it always was a sacred area long before the Jews got there. And what I understand is they were Jewish mercenaries that came over to work for primarily the Ptolemies. That would be after 300 BC. This was an island that was used for the defense of Egypt against other powers at that time, like Persia. Persia did dominate this area for quite some time, so there are Persian manuscripts there too, but primarily Aramaic. And actually, you can get a copy of the Aramaic inscriptions that come out of this place, but it's like $70 on Amazon. I searched all over, and I did find them in PDF right before this started. So next time I can look into that a little bit. If anybody is interested. I want to go into the Onion Temple at Leontopolis too. That's another great, great mystery. Even Josephus knows very little about that. Here we go.
This has to be one of the most dramatic scenes in the world, not just for the beautiful scenery, but for the historical interest it contains. Behind me is the Old Cataract Hotel, made famous by the novel by Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile. And the river itself is, for the first time in its 800-mile course, broken by a cataract. In the olden times, ships wanting to go further south had to be towed up the rapids by men pulling on ropes from the shore, and many a ship was lost in the swirl and rush of water when a tow rope broke. Just a few miles further up that way, you have Philae, the island with the beautiful temples. But the island you can see over there is actually Elephantine Island. It received its name from the water-worn rocks down by the shore of the river, which, so people said, resembled a herd of elephants come here to drink. The ancients called it Yeb or Yebu, and they claimed that the Nile had its source here, despite the fact that the Nile quite clearly ran for hundreds of miles in both directions.
I want you to note Yebu. At Tabernacles, I want to do a Connect the Dots seminar with a couple of things that I found. And one of those things is the distinct comparison between Yebu and Jebu, or Jebus, Jerusalem, and this place with its ancient name. Too many coincidences here between this area and Jerusalem to just leave them unturned, leave those stones unturned. And yes, I thought those big rocks did look like elephants, didn't you?
Mind you, the priests of Philae make the same claim for their island, and with just about as much truth. Elephantine was an important border post between Egypt and Nubia, and often officials, ambassadors, and merchants came here to Aswan and stayed either on the shore or on the island itself before making the journey further south. But so wild and terrible was the land that they went with dread in their hearts. And many, in fact, scratched their names and prayers for a safe journey on a distinctive rock that you can see on the horizon over there, which is now called the Rock of Inscriptions. Modern interest in Elephantine started in 1815 when Giovanni Belzoni, the famous explorer, came here and purchased some papyri from the local inhabitants. They weren't particularly important, but they tipped off other collectors to the fact that papyri could be found here. And many years later, the Reverend John Greville Chesters came here and purchased an important collection of papyri, which he later presented to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford and the British Museum. Then, in the 1890s, a German called William Spiegelberg came here, and he also found papyri, which he acquired from the locals who'd been digging, people in West Aswan, Garb Aswan, over on the other bank, which they'd dug up, quite illicitly of course, and he was followed shortly thereafter by a German expedition. The Germans worked from 1906 to 1908, excavating the Temple of Khnum, which you can see out on the island. They were followed a year later by a French expedition who uncovered the courtyard of the same temple. Now, the reason why these people all came here to dig was because of the papyri. And the fascinating thing about these papyri was they weren't written in Egyptian hieroglyphics, or at least not the ones that people were interested in. They were written in Aramaic, the language of the Bible. And their authors were a Jewish colony who lived down here in the south of Egypt at Aswan. The story of the Jewish colony here at Elephantine is a fascinating one. Of course, we don't know all the details, but from what we can reconstruct, it would seem that round about the year 650 BC, Pharaoh Psamtik I rebelled against the Assyrians, who at that time had conquered and were occupying Egypt. And he was successful in driving out the Assyrians. The problem was that in order to rule Egypt efficiently, the Assyrians had divided the country up into 12 princely states. And none of the other princes were willing to submit to Psamtik. And so he had to fight long and hard to re-establish and reunite the kingdom of Egypt. Just at this time, Israel, Judah, was ruled by bad King Manasseh, who not only was pro-Assyrian in his policies, but also worshipped the false gods and persecuted those who held true to the God of Israel. And so the result was that Jewish fundamentalists, like Muslim fundamentalists who go to Afghanistan or Iraq in order to fight the great Satan of America, Jewish fundamentalists flocked here to Egypt to fight the great Satan of their days, the Assyrians. And Psamtik welcomed them with open arms. He was only too glad to have his forces augmented. He already had Greek mercenaries, and he added to them Jewish mercenaries. When Psamtik finally expelled the last of the Nubian rulers of Dynasty 25, he was the first ruler of Dynasty 26, and expelled them from Egypt, he left his Jewish mercenaries here as a garrison on the border fortress of Elephantine. And they stayed here year after year, generation after generation. Children grew up and followed their parents into, or followed their fathers into the military service, the mercenary service. They were here for 2.5 centuries, right down to 400 BC. Bad King Manasseh ruled for 55 years. And to the exiles here in Elephantine, it must have seemed that his reign was never ending, and that they would never get back to worship God in the temple in Jerusalem, the temple which Manasseh had defiled. And so they built their own temple here on Elephantine. The ruins of the Temple of Khnum, which you can see behind me, probably cover the remains of that temple. We'll never know for sure. It hasn't been found. It may never be found for reasons I'll explain why in a moment. But it would be wonderful if it could be, because almost certainly it was a copy of the temple at Jerusalem. And it would be fascinating to know the ground plan of that famous but now lost building. Interestingly, like the Bible authors, these Jews of Elephantine had no scruples about pronouncing the name of God. That was an affectation that came later. Time and again in their documents, they refer to or swear by the great God Yahweh, or Yahoo. We can't be sure exactly how he was pronounced in the Aramaic. The vowel sounds are not written. Unfortunately, these Jews were not as strict with their monotheism as we could wish, because as well as the great god Yahweh, they also brought with them from Palestine other Canaanite gods, and their documents refer to Anath Bethel and her consort Ashim Bethel. And they swear by these gods also. You can understand why the biblical prophets so often inveighed against the mixing of religions, where the true worship of God was adulterated with the worship of other deities. When the Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BC, they took over the government, and the Jewish mercenaries were only too happy to change sides. They didn't care who paid their wages as long as they were paid. And it came about that the Persians also used them as a garrison, but this time not just against the Nubians in the south, but also to keep control of the local population of Egyptians. And the Egyptians had the unfortunate experience of finding their former employees now their rulers, and it didn't go down too well. Equally unfortunately, the Jews often have a knack for upsetting people. And the Jews here at Elephantine also made themselves unpopular with their fellow mercenaries. In the year 410, the Persian satrap Arsames went back to Persia for consultations with the king, with the government, and the priests of Khnum here on Elephantine promptly took advantage of his absence and bribed the local garrison commander, a man called Widrang, to look the other way, while his son and a group of non-Jewish mercenaries crossed over from this shore over to Elephantine, where they promptly beat up every Jew they could find and razed the temple of Yahweh to the ground, burnt it, destroyed it completely. When Arsames returned a few months later, the Jews of Elephantine had the satisfaction of seeing the priests of Khnum and Widrang punished, but that still left them with no temple. The Jews promptly petitioned to have the temple rebuilt. And in fact, among the documents found here is from the year 407 is one entitled "A Petition Concerning the Rebuilding of the Temple of Yahweh." And it begins, "Now concerning the temple, when Cambyses came here, the temple was already built," showing that it had been here for quite some time. This put Arsames in a difficult position. Although he may have put Widrang and some of the priests of Khnum to death, he didn't want to upset the local population too much. It was all very well keeping his mercenaries happy, but he also needed to keep the Egyptians happy. And if the Egyptian populace was against the rebuilding of the temple, well, and so Arsames adopted a typical Eastern approach to the matter. He compromised. He stalled, he delayed. He told the Jews that they could rebuild their temple provided they got permission from the authorities in Jerusalem. He may have been more clever than the Jews of Elephantine realized, because at this time Jerusalem was controlled by a different sort of Jewish fundamentalists, Ezra and Nehemiah. And Arsames almost certainly knew this and may even have met them on his way to and from Persia. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah were very strict about who they would let build temples. In fact, they wouldn't let anyone else build a temple. When the Samaritans, when Ezra and Nehemiah first came back to Jerusalem, the Samaritans came and said, "Do allow us to join in building the temple of Jehovah with you, because we worship the same God." And Ezra and Nehemiah gave them a very curt refusal, made enemies of them, in fact, by the curtness of their refusal, because their worship was not a strict monotheism. It was not strictly the form that Ezra and Nehemiah recognized. So Arsames undoubtedly knew that the authorities in Jerusalem would not give permission, and so he'd be in the clear, because he would then be able to say, "Well, it's not my fault, I'd gladly give you permission, but your own people refuse." And so the matter would be closed. Well, it all fell out more or less exactly as Arsames had planned. The Jewish authorities were not going to give permission for any other temple to be built, and especially not one in Egypt, and certainly not one where there wasn't strict monotheism. But they too were Easterners. They didn't send back an answer saying no. They simply sent no answer at all. And after a while, after waiting for ages, the Jews of Elephantine got the message. But they were determined. They weren't going to give up. And their next step, recorded thoroughly in the papyri that have been found here, was a very interesting one. The Jews of Elephantine sent their petition to the Samaritans. If their own people would not give them permission, then the Samaritans would, they hoped. And according to the Bible, the ruler of the Samaritans at this time was a man called Sanballat. Now those who don't like the Bible, who are always looking for an excuse or to trump up some reason for not believing it, tried to find fault with this. But the documents here at Elephantine tell us very plainly that the second petition was sent to Arsames, and a copy was sent to the sons of Sanballat the Samaritan. The exact same name. Yet again.
Did you hear that? This is a biblical character. Sanballat is in the book of Nehemiah as the great enemy of the rebuilding of the temple there. A Horonite, a Samaritan.
The historical facts of the Bible are confirmed. The Samaritans, who by this time were enemies of the Jews, as I've already said, were only too glad to get one up on their hated neighbors, and they gladly gave permission, and the temple was rebuilt. But it didn't last. In 402 BC, the Egyptians rebelled against the Persians and drove them out of the country. And in the rebellion, the temple of Yahweh here at Elephantine was again destroyed. It was never rebuilt. And 2 years later, we have the last reference to the Jews of Elephantine. Either they were withdrawn, or more likely, they were wiped out and exterminated in the fighting of the rebellion. And in a sense, that catastrophic end to the Jews of Elephantine was very fortunate. For us, that is. In the same sense that Pompeii was fortunate. Because when Pompeii was wiped out overnight, so much was left behind for the archaeologists to find. And in the same way, when the Jewish colony here at Elephantine was destroyed, all their documents were left behind for us to find. And we don't just have isolated documents, fragments of documents, we have complete archives. There are 11 connected documents from the archives of a woman called Mitpahia. There are 13 from the archive of a man called Ananiah. There are another 11 and a list of names from a man called Yedaniah. And all these documents taken together with all the fragments, enable us to build up a very detailed picture, not just of the history of the Jews of Elephantine, but of the life and culture of the Jews here at Elephantine. And the interesting thing is that not just the Jews at Elephantine, but the documents found here in many ways illuminate and clarify details given in the Bible. I've already mentioned the sons of Sanballat, confirming that there was indeed a Sanballat, just as Ezra and Nehemiah describe. But there were other details that just fit in exactly. For example, there always used to be a question as to which Artaxerxes was meant when Ezra talked about the king of that name. Was it the first, the second, the third? Well, the documents found here clarify for us that it was the first, no other. Some have questioned the detailed interest, the detailed knowledge shown by the Persian court as recorded in the letters in Ezra. The details about the cult, the ritual, the practices that is shown by the book of Ezra. Is it likely, they say, that the Persian court, Zoroastrians to a man, would have such knowledge or even care? Well, the documents here at Elephantine show that the Persian court did know and did care, because among the documents found is one which says,
"To my brother Yedaniah and his colleagues, the Jewish garrison, your brother Hananiah. The welfare of my brothers may God seek at all times. Now this year, the 5th year of King Darius, word was sent from the king to Arsames, saying, authorize a festival of unleavened bread for the Jewish garrison. So do you count 14 days of the month of Nisan and observe the Passover. And from the 15th to the 21st day of Nisan, observe the festival of unleavened bread. Be ritually clean and take heed. Do no work on the 15th or on the 21st day, nor drink beer, nor eat anything in which there is leaven, from the 14th at sundown until the 21st of Nisan. For 7 days it shall not be seen among you. Do not bring it into your dwellings, but seal it up between these dates, by order of King Darius.
Some scholars even developed a theory that the Jews gradually adopted Persian customs, even down to the extent of adopting Persian chronology. And so instead of the Jewish year, which began in the autumn and ran through to the autumn, they gradually changed over and adopted the Persian year, which ran from the spring through to the spring. And so they point to a contradiction in the book of Nehemiah, when Nehemiah says that his friends, his relatives, Hananiah, came to him in the 6th month of a particular year, and then in the 1st month of that same year, he did something or other because of what Hananiah had told him. So you see, there's a contradiction there. The author got it all muddled up. I really do wonder how these people can think that Bible authors were not just careless but plain stupid. Of course, the problem disappears if you accept that the Jews had an autumn to autumn year, because then the 1st month would indeed follow the 6th month. But oh no, the Jews by this time had adopted the Persian calendar, so there must be a contradiction. They had to have adopted the spring to spring. Well, the documents found here at Elephantine tell a different story. The proof concerning the Jewish chronology here turned up, of all places, in a tin trunk in America. I'm seated on the terrace of the Old Cataract Hotel in Aswan, where an American called Wilbur may have sat back in 1893, looking out over this same magnificent landscape of tawny sandhills and the green waters of the Nile in the foreground. Wilbur was an interesting character. He started out as a journalist. He actually taught himself shorthand in order to become a newspaper reporter. Then he went on to be a lawyer, a translator. He translated Victor Hugo's Les Miserables into English. But then he became interested in archaeology. He made many trips to Egypt and in fact became America's first Egyptian archaeologist. In 1893 he came here to Aswan to collect papyri, the same sort of papyri that everyone was interested in. He went back to America, but he only made it as far as Paris, and in 1896 he died in Paris. After his death, his widow asked their children to give his enormous collection of Egyptian objects to the Brooklyn Museum, which is where they still are, where they can be seen. But nobody knew about the objects he'd collected on his last trip. They were in a tin trunk in the hotel in Paris. It was eventually shipped back to New York, but it's still, nobody came near it, nobody was interested in it, until 1947, when at last that tin trunk was found, identified, and opened. And the objects in it, which included the Elephantine papyri, were handed over, presented to the Brooklyn Museum, where Professor Emil Kraling set about the task of translating them and preparing them for publication. In 1953, Professor Emil Kraling of the Brooklyn Museum published some of these papyri. What a revelation they were. For example, they showed that women in the Jewish colony here at Elephantine were quite emancipated. They were even able to stand up in the synagogue and divorce their husbands. Now that's emancipation for you. For example, one of the documents of Mitbahia is her marriage contract, which says,
on the 21st of Chislu, Mashiach Yedoniah, a Jew of Yeb, said to Jezaniah ben Uriah, there is the site of one house belonging to me, which I have given to your Mitbahia, my daughter, your wife. Now I say to you, build and equip that site, and dwell on it with your wife. But you may not sell that house or give it as a present to others. Only your children, by my daughter Mitbahir, shall have power over it after you. If you build upon this land, and then my daughter divorces you and leaves you, she shall have no power over it in return for the work you have done.
Notice those words, if my daughter divorces you. It was just as well they were written in, because Mitbahir did indeed divorce the unfortunate Jazaniah. She married an Egyptian, a non-Jew, an Egyptian called Pai. And that marriage too didn't last, and she ended up marrying a Jew called Ashur. She must have been quite some girl. And again, we have a marriage contract drawn up for this Ashur, which says,
I have given you, as the bride price of your daughter Mitbahir, 5 shekels, royal weight. It has been received by you, and your heart is content. Should Ashur die, having no child, male or female, by his wife Mitbahir, Mitbahir shall be entitled to the house, chattels, and all other worldly goods of Ashur. Should Mitbahir stand up in congregation and declare, I divorce my husband, the price of divorce shall be on her head. She shall weigh out to Ashur 7 shekels, but all she brought with her she shall take out and go whither she will without suit or process.
We in the West are shocked sometimes at the ease with which Muslim men can divorce their wives. All they have to do is say in front of witnesses 3 times, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, I divorce thee, and that's it. But Mitbahir, all she had to do was stand up in the congregation, and in front of the congregation, the witnesses say, I divorce my husband, and yet another husband got his marching orders.
That is profound, especially if that came with the authority of Israel or Samaria. And I know that passage, I think it's in Deuteronomy 16, where you have the get, where you just stand up or actually give a document that says 3 times, I despise you, and you're divorced. Well, I thought it should be that way with a woman, and here we have some strong evidence that it was.
From Mitbahir. With all this marrying and divorcing and questions of dowries and all that sort of thing, marriage contracts here in the Jewish colony of Elephantine had to be watertight. And that meant, among other things, that they had to be properly dated. Now, there were 3 calendars in use on Elephantine. There was the Egyptian one of 360 days, well, 360 days plus 5, and not a quarter. There was the Persian calendar, and there was the Jewish calendar. And in order to make clear which date is meant, many of these contracts are double dated in terms of the Jewish calendar and in terms of the Persian calendar, or in terms of the Jewish calendar and in terms of the Egyptian calendar. There's even 1 or 2 that are triple dated, using all 3 so that there could be no question about what date was intended. Elephantine Papyrus, or Brooklyn Papyrus number 6, is double dated. But the date that is given, the combination of Persian and Jewish calendars, is such that only one possible day can be meant, and that is a day in the year 520 BC. But it only fits, it only makes sense if we assume an autumn-to-autumn calendar, not the Persian spring-to-spring. So in other words, the Elephantine documents prove that the Jews were using an autumn-to-autumn calendar, despite the fact that these were people in Persian employ, despite the fact that they had been away from their homeland for 2.5 centuries, they still clung to their autumn-to-autumn calendar. And when you combine this with the evidence from the book of Nehemiah, we can be certain that all the Jews in Palestine, in Egypt, no doubt in Persia also, used their own autumn-to-autumn calendar. I've already mentioned that there are some people who seem to like to discredit the Bible. Perhaps they're looking for a hook on which to hang their lack of faith, their lack of belief. But the documents found here at Elephantine enable us to be so confident in the historical accuracy of the Bible. It confirms for us which Artaxerxes was meant by Ezra when he described the famous decree of Ezra chapter 7. And it enables us to pinpoint that decree to the year 457 BC, which may seem a minor detail, were it not for the fact that a most interesting prophecy in the book of Daniel hangs upon that very point. Which year was the 7th year of which Artaxerxes? Fascinating facts, confirming biblical truth, dredged up from the dry dust of history, and of course, from the wonderful river Nile.
Well, there are some discoveries to look into for sure. It's surprising how difficult it is to get a summarized account like that. I've been searching and searching and going through texts that skirt such issues or aren't forthcoming, especially concerning the Jews there. But to find that video, at least it gives us a place to start on this. And I think maybe next week we'll take a look at some of these Aramaic documents. They might contain some other things that we can use to give certain proofs about certain manners, customs, traditions, and practices. Anything to add?
Yeah, if
Add it.
Anybody who has studied this sort of stuff that you put out there, who got a hold and has some different sort of viewpoints on historical things, if they get a hold of these translations, there's no telling what might click. You know, it might prove a lot of interesting things. Of course, it might prove nothing much, but it would be cool to put people who are alternative thinkers onto this kind of stuff and see what gets turned up. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, I think that most of those, at least that we know, wouldn't even take the time to look at it if it was against their own beliefs. At least that's what I have found so many to have that attitude. But the Nehemiah thing, and to have Sanballat as a historical character, and the divorce thing, and the very fact that there are personal letters over there, and some of these letters deal with biblical subjects, that, yes, I would think that would be very interesting for somebody that was a bookworm.
Or even the what he was saying about the calendar, and the Persian calendar and the Jewish calendar start in end of what month and all. I mean, get a calendar aficionado onto that and see what they can tear up out of it. That would be really cool.
One of the things about that calendar is that the Jews always had a double calendar.
Right.
Yeah, they had a feast calendar and they had a secular calendar. And all the Jews went by the secular calendar with the exception of those under the authority of Sadducees, because they still continued to use a Persian calendar. The
Right.
Pharisees continued to use a Greek calendar. The Jews continued to use a Jewish calendar, but not for feasts.
Right. Feast was different, but still,
Mhm.
there might be some interesting detail in there that might explain how things get adopted or changed or left alone. Just something. I mean, this is a whole new book to be read, man. You know.
Well, I think that what I downloaded, the name of the document, it's got an abbreviated name, the TAD, the Aramaic documents, TAD. And I can put that up for you and give you a link. I'm going to read through them probably tonight because my interest is piqued now. And I thought going through that, there are probably a half dozen different research projects that could be done if anybody had the time and were encouraged to do them. Just to find out that these guys in Nehemiah were real. Because they're not painted very well in Nehemiah, and they're painted with a very dark brush.
Well, that some of this might back up a theory I'm working too. So I'm
What's
very
that?
interested. It's about a power struggle after they came out of Babylon, and possibly how a link to Egypt was destroyed. There's a verse, and I think it's in 2 Kings, about one of the ruling class destroying the chariots and horses of the god that were on the temple, and it's right after they came back from captivity, and I think that goes along with the power struggle. And the people who had gone into captivity were mostly people who could be either ransomed or were of the nobility, leaving the people who were mixed race and Samaritans and the impoverished behind. The people who were of no value, while they were gone, they built up their own economy and power structure. But when the captives came back, those, and they actually had a little fracas. I forget the name of it over that. And I'm wondering if some of the stuff that has been transmitted down to us might have an older version that's been suppressed, but maybe left more intact somewhere else than what we have received, or if it's, whoever wins writes the history,
Oh yeah.
So I've got a little interest in that myself, just to see.
My understanding is that the majority of Jews did not want to go back. They had prospered so much in Babylon and in Assyria over the course of that time, and those two nations or empires were merged by the time that Darius or Cyrus let them go. And in Nehemiah, there's really not reference to many or any Jews that I can think of. Only in chapter 8, you've got yourself a congregation there, and people are shouting amen and worshiping, and they're listening to the book and all this, but it doesn't say anything about anybody being there except these Samaritan, this Horonite, and another guy who's an Arabian, and they're all fighting to keep Nehemiah and Ezra from doing anything. So just to have some historical documentation for that whole Nehemiah, Ezra, first Esdras cycle
Yes.
is going to be good to see what's in these. And then again, there might not be anything in here worthwhile except what that fellow just elucidated. So we'll see. Let me look this up. I've got it on my computer here, but I'll give you a link to it if you're interested in doing that. That goes for anybody that's listening to this on YouTube or wherever else we have our podcasts. And I might say, if you're wanted to know about this and you're listening on a podcast, you'll want to go out to our YouTube channel and watch the video itself. Okay, thank you for coming. I enjoyed this a lot for a change. I'll talk to you in a little bit, Allison.